Russians don't care about the civilian casualties in Ukraine. It doesn't affect me. My life is fine. But if all of a sudden they can no longer order goods to be delivered tomorrow, it affects their life. I think bringing the war home to the Russians is probably the most important thing, because that really does create pressure on Putin and on the government to justify the war. And the less justification they have, the less sacrifice Russians are going to want to make. The attack on the Wildberries warehouses is a combination of an economic, military, and psychological war on the Russians. The most sort of practical reason for attacking it is that they distribute military goods across the country. It's a logistics hub and so on. And so you can see the military rationale for doing it. But on top of that, this is a highly indebted company. I think they have something like $15 billion worth of debt that comes from a bunch of major Russian banks. And it's also a very important hub of economic activity for many Russians inside of Russia. And so by hitting that, it harms the banking system. It harms a lot of the businesses that are doing business with Wildberries. Those people have borrowed money also from the banking system. But perhaps the third and most important reason, I believe, why the Ukrainians are doing this and why it has an effect is that Russians, for the most part, don't care about the civilian casualties in Ukraine. They're saying, yeah, whatever, as long as our life is fine, Putin can conduct this war. Yeah, those foreign Ukrainians are bad or whatever. And they don't care. They say, it doesn't affect me. My life is fine. But if all of a sudden they can no longer order goods to be delivered tomorrow, it affects their life in the same way as it affects their life that the internet was turned off in Moscow and St. Petersburg, in the same way it affects their life that they can't get gasoline on a moment's notice. They have to stand in line for 3 or 4 hours in a lot of different situations. This is bringing the war home to the Russians, to the Russian people, to the very cynical Russian people who don't care about killing Ukrainians. And all of a sudden they're being inconvenienced. And all of a sudden they've got to say to themselves, well, wait a second, what's the point of all this war when I can't order my goods the next day? And I think that if I were to rank the 3 different reasons why Ukraine is doing this, I think bringing the war home to the Russians is probably the most important thing that they're doing, because that really does create pressure on Putin and on the government to justify the war. And the less justification they have, the less sacrifice Russians are going to want to make. And perhaps at some point, the wave of indignation in Russia becomes unbearable for Putin. It's really important for everybody to know that there is no such thing as a democracy of free political expression, of freedom of the press in Russia. It's all very, very tightly controlled. In the past, they put on a pantomime to say that there's an election coming up. There are different groups vying for their seats in the parliament and so on and so forth. And within that pantomime, you could have an anti-war party or an anti-corruption party who wouldn't get many votes. And then Putin could look to the West and look to the Russians and look to everybody and say, look, we have a democracy like anybody else. It's just, we won, they lost, end of story. Now he can't even afford to do this pantomime. Any small indication that he's not doing a perfect job, that everything is not going as well as planned, is potentially very lethal for him. And the situation in Russia is really a very hard to measure situation, but it's one in which you could really, there's no elections or no political polling that will measure anything, but at some point, and nobody knows exactly what this point will be, the anger inside Russia may overcome the fear inside Russia. And if that were to happen, then people will say, I don't care if I'm putting myself at risk, I'm going to march on the Kremlin. And if enough people feel that, and 1 million people march on the Kremlin, Putin is finished. He understands that. He knows that that's his big risk. And so he's got to do whatever he can to stop that. And so what are the tools at his disposal? Well, it used to be that he could sort of subdue the anger with money. He could pay people money. He could give people better benefits when there was money flowing around. But there's no money flowing around. And so at this point, the only thing that he can control is fear, repression. And so I would predict that as time goes on, the repression gets more and more. People may eventually be forced into a situation where they can't even leave the country without applying for an exit visa. These are the types of things that happened in during the Soviet Union. These are things that happen in repressive regimes. And there's no reason to think that Putin is not going to really tighten the screws on the Russian people going forward. I don't believe that there's any political organization in Russia that can truly challenge Putin. No organized political situation, because Putin is out there sniffing around very, very aggressively with all of his organs of repression, looking for anybody who doesn't agree with him. And so far left, far right, far anything doesn't really have an opportunity to grow and expand, because those people will be quickly quashed, put in jail, assassinated, whatever can happen. I think that the most likely scenario is that Putin doesn't get overthrown. That's the really high probability scenario. But a low probability scenario is that he does something which is just so enraging to the Russian people that they put down all of their fear, or I should say that the anger is so overwhelming that the fear is subdued and it all goes viral, and then there's nothing he can do about it. I don't put that as a high probability, but I think that's more likely than any oligarchs. I don't think an oligarch is ever going to challenge him. And any type of disloyalty in the ranks would be quickly snuffed out, as would any kind of political organization. And so what this most likely will have to come from just a mass disorganized uprising, because that's the one thing that he is unable to control. He can't nip that in the bud. That's the kind of thing which just goes, happens without any planning, without any prediction. And that's what happens in other countries. The Arab Spring started in Tunisia when a fruit seller set himself on fire, and all of a sudden the country's government was overthrown. And that then led to Egypt having their government overthrown. These are very hard things to predict. What you can predict is that, or I should say what you can look at and analyze, is the level of anger. And the level of anger, of course, is rising. And then the question is, how much higher does that level of anger have to rise before people put aside their fear? I think this war is going to end in a very undramatic way. I think this war is going to end in the way that the Korean War ended. And what I mean by that is that you have a situation right now where Russia attacks Ukrainian civilians and kills them on a daily basis, and Ukraine attacks Russian economic assets and destroys them on a daily basis. I suspect that the economic pain that Putin is suffering is going to become so great that he's not going to want this oil refineries all destroyed. And he may say to the Ukrainians quietly, we won't bomb your civilians if you don't bomb our oil refineries. It's not going to be a peace treaty. It's not going to be a dramatic thing. It's going to be something done quietly, at which point you no longer have this air war going on. And then all you have is the front line. And on the front line, the Ukrainians have been very successful at creating a kill zone. So the Russian soldiers, any of them entering into this kill zone, automatically die from drone attacks. And so you end up in a kill zone where the Russians aren't making any progress. And I can imagine that over time, it may just quiet down. And there's never going to be an agreement. Putin's never going to declare defeat. He's never going to compromise. But eventually the war just dies down. That's kind of how I would imagine this war ending. Not in some dramatic sit down with a treaty and a declaration of peace, but just in a quiet, unresolved way where the countries are all still at war, but they're not doing much.